know, you, you can become very singular in what you need. But what really was special about this project is it opened it up to all the entities to really focus on the need rather than, the focus of the particular entity. So I just wanted to share that because it was pretty powerful when all of a sudden you worked with individuals and you had the message to strip away the boundaries. And that's how we moved really pretty quickly from where we're at, a year and a half, a year ago to today.
Absolutely. I think you guys will see the collaboration. As Todd mentioned, I think Todd and I did not know each other until about 2 years ago when we met. But we both had similar visions of what could be possible. And that collaboration of our organizations were deeply partnered. So to give a little context of our regional efforts, in Larimer County, there's always been an awareness that there was a need to shelter individuals, unaccompanied youth. Unfortunately, the state had certain regulations that were really hard to overcome. So prior to 2019, regulation was that you had to carry a child care license. So even though you were sheltering, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, to shelter youth under the age of 18, you had to have a 24-hour child care license. And that was a pretty extreme bar for most organizations to be able to meet. And the other issue in our regional area is that we didn't have a physical building. We didn't have the brick and mortar. And even though there were a number of people who back in 2018 came together to identify the need, we still were unable to identify a building. And at the time, then COVID hit, and COVID really reduced our work in this area. There were a lot of other needs that rose higher. It didn't mean that this population wasn't needed to be focused on. There were just so many other things that the school district was focusing on, ourselves were focusing on, that permitted us to not give the attention that it needed. In May of 2022, or May of 2022, Todd and I both were in different meetings, but the shelter was brought up as a possibility. The Larimer County Commissioners had called together a forum and said, here is an issue in our community. There were about 60 different individuals who attended my meeting. And really, it was a call to action by our county commissioners. And I sat in a particular group personally in a group that was, here are some housers and here are some youth providers who do both of those. And I sheepishly sat there and was surprised to be the only one who did both, and knew that we had a lot of work to do as an organization to continue the support that we had set out to do as an organization. And so I committed then. I did not know I was committing to building a shelter, but I committed to doing work in the area. And I'll let Todd kind of talk about his experience of how he heard about the need and where that came from.
Yeah, so as Nicole was saying, separate paths, we were working, kind of parallel paths together. And, being in a district, we see a lot of the students and the needs out there day to day. So whether it be McKinney-Vento, the federally, mandates that we have to say, okay, you need to provide transportation or food, these pieces. So you felt the need out there. And it was a tour that we did in Boulder that kind of was got this ball rolling. But yeah, with Nicole's work and their background, ours, and kind of knowing the need but not knowing what to do, that's really when we met and said, you know what, we can do this. And it almost started as easy as that. And then when the purpose and the why behind what you're doing is that great, and people can see that, yeah, real quick, it picked up steam, as you'll see here. And steam between dollars, partnerships, our Board of Education, donating a facility, county commissioners, city level, and writing letters of support. And all of a sudden we're in front of the state, in an area that school districts aren't usually, Department of Housing, and, working on grants, getting those pieces put together. And Nicole had to educate me a little bit, say, hey, this is what you're doing now, because you're in a totally different sector. But that's what it took, was figuring out those pieces, to get a lot of the dollars that were out there.
And during the first time I ever met Todd, he said, I have some underused buildings. Why don't you come and look at them? And he took us on a tour. There were four of us, took us on a tour. And the first building, it could have worked. Wasn't the ideal building. But then took us to the building you saw in the beginning of this PowerPoint. And I remember us walking through, and we stood in one room, which will be the kitchen moving forward. And we stood in that room and we said, this will be our youth shelter. And we just knew. And Todd said, okay, let me take this back to the Board of Education. And I give a lot of credit to the Board of Education through Thompson School District, because they continued to have those conversations and believed in the project from its infancy. We had no funding at that point. We just had a brick and mortar, which we were moving forward with. And so we knew that we needed to form a group of committed individuals in the community who could help with the foundational work that was needed to put in some grants. And that's when you started to see some of our community partners come to that table. And that's when, as Todd talks about, you have the Department of Human Services. They knew from the infancy that they needed to be a part of our conversation. You had Poudre School District knowing that they couldn't get the brick and mortar, but the population of youth that we work with is transient. And it's really important that both districts are working collaboratively to support the population. You also had CSU come in. You had Homeward Alliance, who is a staple in our Northern Colorado area for working with those experiencing homelessness. So we had this foundational group, and we worked to establish funding. Our Larimer County partners quickly came on board to issue $1.5 million worth of support for our project. And that gave a lot of clout and a lot of opportunity for us to then move forward to doing that was very quick, to moving forward to establishing some framework that we needed, knowing that there were some state funding that was available for transformational projects. So we worked together to establish a grant writer and then to start our grant writing process. There were two grants, one for infrastructure and one for operations. We also hired an architecture firm called Shopworks, which is trauma-informed design. That's their specialty. They had worked with other shelters in the past and were a great fit to work with the needs of our project. And helped quickly establish a needs assessment, but also put together just the voice of youth experiencing homelessness in the Northern Colorado area so that we could have that documentation when we went forth to apply for grants. We completed the application for both transformational grants, and then we had to sit and wait. And these two particular grants, there were many different iterations of allocations that came out. What they didn't tell us was that if you applied for both, that you had to wait longer to hear the results. And so we ended up hearing from the state, and we ended up getting fully funded 2 days shy of that day that we stood in the building to say this will be the youth shelter, which is pretty amazing to think about when you think about within a year, we were able to secure a building, funding to move, to help with kind of that runway for operational costs, and funding to help with the full remodel of the building. That's pretty incredible, to be thinking a year later, here we go. And that's where we've been for this last year, is in the design phase. And so we went along the journey. We also really wanted to engage our community partners, or our community that's surrounding the shelter. And I always tell people, when we held the community meeting, I too, if I was living in the neighborhood and a building was going from early childhood building and turning into a youth shelter, I would have lots of wonderings and curiosities of what would that look like in my community? How is that going to impact my lifestyle in my neighborhood? And so we held the meeting at Thompson School District and in their administrative offices. We had about 30 individuals attend, and it was an incredible meeting. I think we, I would say for both Todd and I, we went in a little bit apprehensive of what was going to be heard, and, how do we work with the community? The community came to the space and it was beautiful. They asked questions, but their questions were more about, what's the sustainability plan? How do we volunteer? How is this project funded? And then as we were finishing up, there was a gentleman who raised his hand and said, we need this project and we need this work. And they all clapped. It was incredible, to be a part of that meeting. I think we left feeling very much support, and committed to continuing that journey with the neighborhood ongoing, to say, we want you to embrace us as much as we embrace you as a community. The church right across the street from the shelter is Zion Lutheran Church, or it's Zion Lutheran. And they actually reached out to me prior to me reaching out to them and said, we just wanted to let you know that our board of directors voted that we support this project. It was just a very incredible opportunity to see a community come forward and support the project. I don't know, Todd, if you have any feedback around that community meeting, but it was, to my experience, was incredible.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is so as we put the schedule together, you can see, a year ago-ish, we're on track. So we're getting ready to start construction. I'll say any day. We're finalizing some permitting. And we actually permitted this through the state of Colorado, because we maintain ownership of the building. We didn't go through local zoning or local building department. We actually went through the state. So that is a whole nother process in itself, but it really helped expedite some of the review and then some of the complications that might be out there. So the exciting part is we're actually getting ready to start here in the next few weeks and open by that really the fourth quarter in 24. So we're still on track for our original schedule.
Absolutely. And as Todd mentioned, part of our process was also to name the shelter, and we really deeply wanted the community voice in that process. And so we started that journey back in October, November, and had over 200 people submit possibilities of names. And then we narrowed it down through some different focus groups and then did a vote on the top 5. And so and had over 800 people vote on the name. And so the landing really comes from the community and the voice of the community, to name the shelter. It was about 15% of the individuals who completed the survey had experienced foster care themselves, which is it's a data point that 40%, up to 40% of youth who age out of the foster care system end up homeless within the first year of aging out. And so having that voice in that space, I think, is an incredibly important part of the naming for the shelter. We did a groundbreaking just like 3 weeks ago, and had a great turnout and opportunity for people to walk through the building and then Now it'll kind of go under construction, and as Todd mentioned, we hope to open in late this year, early next year is our goal. So yeah, we're excited. What am I missing, Todd?
Not much. And we have a few more slides, but that's really what that's really the project in itself. I think when you look at the collaboration, the different entities come together, the relationship between, TSD and then Matthews House, and how we put this different service pieces together to align with an educational facility, the grant dollars, and now it's working with the Matthews House and us to say, okay, what services are there? What are the operations, the daily operations going to look like? So as you can see, the story started with us having conversation through grants. Then now we're into, okay, we're getting ready to open in a few months. And what is this going to look like for kids? So what is this going to look like for those youth that need this type of service? So there's a video here, and we can share this with you as well. I think it's about 6 minutes long, but it kind of goes through a little more of the story of the shelter in Matthews House and what that looks like. So I don't know if you want to play that now, or maybe just give it to you to view at your leisure.
Well, I think it would be worth showing. I'd vote to show it.
Okay, I'm curious if you guys can hear it. If I'm playing it, can y'all hear it? I'm not really tech savvy. So if I'm playing it, can you guys hear this?
Teachers were noticing something was going on, and I
Can you
didn't want
hear?
to end up in foster care, so I stopped going to school.
No, Cole, now we can't hear it.
People won't fight there.
That might be, you might be hearing it through my speaker.
People look at me like I should just
Can you
go
hear
get
it
a
now?
job and I'm being lazy. But I don't know how I am supposed to do that when I don't even have anywhere to take a shower or clean my clothes. I left home when I was 17. I didn't feel safe with the drugs going on in my house or the people my mom was bringing home. I'm not sleeping on the streets or at a shelter, but I don't have a home to go to anymore. So I guess I'm homeless. I just crash wherever I feel safe. I think youth experiencing homelessness versus adults experiencing homelessness is very different. When we think adults experiencing homelessness, we think an adult on the street living in their car or living in inhabitable places. When we think of youth experiencing homelessness, I think it looks a lot more like youth couch surfing, going from friend to friend's house or family member to family member's house, making day by day decisions to get through and kind of masked from that overall community view of homelessness.
The number of youth experiencing homelessness is much higher than most people in our community would understand. At the end of each year, each school year for the past several, Thompson School District has had over 800 students identified as experiencing homelessness underneath the guidelines of the McKinney-Vento Act.
The youth moves from one house to the next house, so friends to family, back and forth. They don't have a place to call their own, a place to put their belongings, a place to consistently know they have to eat and shower. The basic human needs that most of us take for granted every day are up in jumble for these youth.
Those basic things that we take for granted that those students don't get to do anymore. How can you invite a friend over? How can you do these things? How can you go out for the football team when you don't have a place to wash your uniform? All those small things that we don't think about as a community that we take for granted that these students are having to fight with every day.
When a youth is a student and they're in a school, they're a part of the system, during the day, they have a consistent, stable, sustainable place to be. When school is out, they may not have that place, and they're incredibly vulnerable when they are out in our community without knowing where their next place to take a nap or next place to go to sleep is going to be, or where they're going to get their next meal.
So a lot of the youth that we see that have instability at home and choose to run away out into the community are more susceptible to engaging with other adults or strangers. Sometimes that opens the youth up to be a victim of human trafficking. We have seen a lot of that increase in our community.
You know, one of the scariest things about youth being on the run is their inability to access services. A lot of our kids who leave their home for whatever reason, they have mental health issues, they have substance use issues, you know, they're struggling with something. And when they're, you know, on the run, they're not able to access those services. Most of the services in our community are set up where you walk in with your parent, not you walk in by yourself. And there's a lot of questions that they don't want to answer, so they're not going to access services, which again creates this cycle where things just begin to, you know, get worse.
In the cases that I've worked with, I've seen that a lot of the youth are struggling with direction, so case management, where they just don't know where to go, don't know how to access the resources. And because it's so new to them, they often are overwhelmed in the process, and it's paralyzing in some cases.
I think one of the things that just breaks my heart is sometimes families will come to us, you know, in child welfare and sometimes delinquency and just say, you know, how do I make a referral on myself because I need help and I don't know how else to get it. And there should never be a world where child welfare and juvenile justice are the way to access services.
So the difficult part that the school district finds themselves in is that we have so many resources for students who are experiencing homelessness or going through other things in their life, but it's Monday through Friday from 8 to 4:30. And it's so how can we as a school district think critically and think differently to help students and families have access to resources like the Matthews House to help them move forward out of campus and in essence support them beyond the school bell.
We aren't service providers. We're not set up to be that. Our goal, our focus is to be sure that students are safe and learning when they're with us in their schools. And so we can remove those barriers to keep them in school, but we are not able to provide any sort of overnight shelter type situation, any sort of stability in housing. In particular, when we're talking about unaccompanied youth that are under the age of 18, there's no place for them to go. And that's a problem. That's something that as a community we have to come together to solve, because these are our youth, these are our students, they're part of our community, and we need to be sure that they have a safe place, a welcoming place, and a stable place to be.
So we can definitely share that video too. It looked like there were a couple. What does it mean? So I've seen your accompanied youth. What does accompanied youth mean? So we usually refer to it as unaccompanied, and I think what your what you might be saying is McKinney-Vento versus unaccompanied. So those are two different numbers. So McKinney-Vento is, and Todd, would you like to give the federal? You might be better at that than me.
Yeah, McKinney-Vento is actually set by the federal government. It's guidelines in which they set different parameters that you know, our students might fall under. So, for example, I don't have the exact thresholds, but if they fall within the McKinney-Vento Act, then we have to provide transportation to what school they might go to. That's when you look at after-school services. We help with even food. So food insecurities we help with in school. So it's guidelines set, income guidelines set by the federal government, basically, that says, okay, school districts, for this section of student that is labeled this, you have to provide these services for. So we, in those services, when they're, you know, I hate to say labeled, but when they are placed underneath that McKinney-Vento Act, it says that they're underneath the income threshold, and then typically have housing insecurities. So, you know, although they might not be specifically, you know, homeless, I'll say, they have insecurities that fall within a more general structure to help that helps us help them. So I hope that helps.
And Todd, I was the one that typed that question so poorly because my internet's out and I'm on a cell phone. But I read this in an article, so that's why I asked the question, and it did use the word unattended. So that's where that came from. So I guess the question is, if we were to look at, say, Larimer County, how many youth are in this category of truly being homeless, and how many would you put in the category of being housing insecure?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's, both probably Nicole and I can help that. It's complicated because some we can easily identify, within the different acts we have. The challenging part is there's some that we can't identify. There's the challenges when you look at youth and especially teenagers. It's hard to say, okay, teenagers, come identify yourself. That's the hardest time in sometimes the social setting. So you're asking them already a tough spot, going through tough parts of their life to then come and say, oh, identify yourself so we can, provide different services. So I don't know, Nicole, if you have more of the actual numbers, but yeah, there is a difference between those two. And as far as actually homeless, I don't know, Nicole, do you have that?
So I think Julie, one of your questions might actually go along with more, so not to get fully off track, but there is a process called the Continuum of Care, the Northern Colorado Continuum of Care. And that was implemented, it's a federal implementation. Different counties belong to different Continuum of Cares. And that's where families and youth can identify, and that data point, and I can look this up and send it, would be more clearly a statement of those who are truly unhoused, living in shelter based versus maybe housing insecure, doubling up, and may not be eligible, deemed living directly homeless. And that number looks a little different. So as Todd mentioned, McKinney-Vento is a little bit different. Their terminology for those experiencing homelessness looks different than the terminology used for Continuum of Care. But the Continuum of Care is where it's coordinated work and entry for providers to all work together to support the population of youth, or not just youth, but families, individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Everyone goes into this system through different avenues in hopes that there's a coordinated way to support finding stability in housing. So like housing vouchers live through this system. So I don't know if that helps, Julie. It's pretty complex of like one number versus another number.
Yeah, I absolutely, I know precision's difficult. It was just, I know this is more than we think. What I really was trying to get a deeper understanding of is how big is the issue. So yeah, your thoughts on that are appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, and we know in Northern Colorado, if I just take out if I take out the term of McKinney-Vento, we know through the school districts, 10 of the different school districts, and combined from Weld and Larimer, that there are 400 plus unaccompanied youth, which that means those individuals do not have a parent and are truly living in an unsheltered environment. Traditionally unsheltered might be couch surfing, but they really are not in a permanent secured environment, or even temporarily. As Todd mentioned, we know adolescents often will jump from one couch to the next couch, whatever is available, and truly do not self-identify. So we don't see that number as prominently in our data because kiddos don't choose to self-select into this population. It's not really a title they want to have per se. And so they choose to opt into living in that space. So we know just based on self-reflection that there's over 400. How much more of those young adults are actually over 18 experiencing homelessness. We don't know that because the school district doesn't track kids who are not in their school district in that number. So these are some of the services that will be housed through the shelter. In different supportive groups, again, working in collaborative effort with our community partners. So working with the workforce center, working with the school districts across the board for academics, working with Summit Stone to provide mental health, and then drop-in services for the basic needs, from showering to doing laundry to doing community resources. Our next slide. So this is a floor plan of ours. And so this is how the shelter the layout of the shelter. You'll notice that there's two, it looks dormitory style. That is because of regulation. Children 15 to 17 have to be in different sleeping quarters than kiddos who are 18 to 20. Our shelter will have ages 15 to their 21st birthday. And this provides us that requirement for licensing. You'll also notice we'll have a commercial kitchen. We'll also have a community kitchen. So if meals are, the kiddos come in during the middle of the day and they're hungry, they can use the kitchen. There's classrooms, there's different kind of just spaces in which individuals can come in, utilize different resources, use the laundry, but also receive other academic support. So this is our shelter. And I want to say, here's another video. It's a fly through if you guys would like to watch it. It's pretty short, but this will be what the interior looks like. So that is our video. So question, how many nights can a youth maintain in the shelter, and what is the process for being able to access services? The shelter will allow the youth, it depends on the age. So 15 to 17, there is a 21-day consecutive period of time that they can stay, and that's the keyword, is consecutive. And then the other process of accessing, what is the process? And then the older kiddos can stay longer, as long as they're working towards their goals, towards stability and finding housing and employment. What is the process for being able to access services? We're continuing to work on kind of how will that look? Will kiddos just come straight in? What does that access point look like? The drop-in services will look different than the overnight services. And so we're continuing to work with the state on licensing right now and kind of what does all of our intake process look like? But we'll communicate that out. So will they be, if someone dropped out of school, what would that look like? Yes, absolutely. They will be connected to educational services and support. I think that's been one of those aspects. As we work alongside Thompson, we also are able to, we have already connected with all of the, from Estes Park to Poudre to Windsor, Severance to Johnstown, Milliken, and District 6. So we believe deeply that we know Thompson is not the only ones who have unaccompanied youth. And so how do we work within those spaces to ensure if they have a youth experiencing homelessness, how do we support the overnight sheltering part and then get them back into their school date? So there's a couple more questions. What is the capacity each night? So currently the setup is 20 beds. But what the beds, it's designed to actually, each of those dormitory rooms that you saw, each of those beds are bunkable. So we can eventually add if needed, dependent on what does, the different populations look like. If a student can only stay 21 days, that is a great question. So 15 to 17-year-old, those are state regulations that they can only stay 21 days. We must be working with child welfare or seeking out more permanent solutions. I often speak, I'm a foster to adopt parent of an adolescent, and having a child be raised in a shelter at 15, that's not where we would want a 15-year-old to be raised. They need more constant and secure environment. And so working towards what is a healthy solution for that individual. We also understand fully that sometimes returning home is not the correct solution. Are there alternatives that are supportive that we can look into? And so we're working closely with the Department of Human Services to develop our kind of chain of commands. What will we do? Who will we call? And what does that process look like? Because we do have to engage child welfare in those cases under 18. We have to notify them within 48 hours. But that does not mean that they'll immediately come out. It means that we notify them and that if we're working on a solution with family, then we have the opportunity to work on that while also just keeping them aware of the status. Any other questions?
Going once, any other questions? Such an exciting project, though. Todd and Nicole will be really excited to watch it develop. And hopefully when it's finished, maybe we can come over and get a tour if you do things before you open up for full service. So we do thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. And we wish you the best of luck and thank you for all you're doing to support the youth in our community. It's really important work. We
Well, thank you all.
recognize. Yes. All right, so we thank you, Todd and Nicole. The rest will drop off as well. The only thing I have is just to remind you that June 12th at 7 is the League of Women Voters legislative wrap-up session. So they'll be sharing all the information about the bills that passed and maybe some that didn't. So otherwise, we'll be in touch regarding the summer, but at this point, probably not meeting in June. So we'll regroup and communicate with you as time moves on. All right. So I wish you a good evening and thanks so much for coming this evening.